Dear guests, the year of 2022 brought something usual to the European continent. That is war and confrontation between nations. Let me be clear that the history of Europe is the history of wars and conflict. And the whole thing erupted in 2022 because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It completely changed the continent, it changed its history, and it put us back into the notion of what we want from history, from our own personal experience. So in this conversation with Vava, we discuss exactly that. We discuss how to live through 2023 with a war unfolding. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and share with your friends. And as always, enjoy. Do you have any expectations from the next year?
You're asking me if I have expectations. Does it mean do I have positive expectations or overall predictions?
Whatever expectations you have, it goes well in both directions.
Well, in terms of positive developments, I don't see too many, I guess. I have already sold this grim perspective in our discussions before. Going back to the topics that we discussed about problems with differing interests over the world and the impossibility of finding a settlement acceptable to different sides in international politics, the expectations that I have is conflict, lots of conflict, and in various parts of the world. I guess the most obvious being Ukraine, which we've already discussed. I don't see this conflict ending next year. What do you think?
Me neither, in short. But yeah, of course, but it's interesting how the situation still plays out. And I'm pretty sure we all agree that this conflict is one that will last for a longer period of time. Although I don't think everyone thinks so. At least the people in the West certainly live in a dream world. But yeah, it's pretty scary thought that we will have this conflict going into the second year, in a sense. So how do you see like any changes in the conflict itself?
From a purely military point of view, first of all, many people count and hope, I guess.
Many people will die.
Yes, that's certainly true. But for now, for like more like shorter perspective, that is the coming winter. So I guess from right now until February and March, many people say that the conflict will die down and both sides will take a moment to catch a breath, to restock their supplies, to let their soldiers rest. But I don't really know where this assumption is coming from. All the major wars that we have seen in the previous 100 years, the fighting didn't die down during the winter. Some of the most major offensives of World War II happened during the winter. The conditions are harsher, of course, but I don't see why, for example, the Ukrainian army would stop pressing, having, for now at least, the strategic initiative. Resting now would not be in their interest. So I do expect the fighting to continue. I don't think the conflict will freeze over the winter. But once temperature starts going up again, the ferocity of the fights will go up because the terrain will be easier to traverse. It will be easier to supply your troops. So the fighting will continue. It will be maybe less severe during the winter, but it will not stop. And certainly, I expect a bloody summer because usually in wars, summers are the most bloody.
Yeah, and it will be the second year, so in a sense, I guess both sides have some hopes and expectations that something groundbreaking happening. But of course, it's a very probably protracted conflict. I mean, many other events. It's interesting how this conflict plays out vis-a-vis other events, like in the sense that it will be with us for a while, maybe even for like 5-10 years down the road.
Yes, certainly. Because you need to have some major political shift, either in Washington or in Kiev or in Moscow, for the conflict to be resolved. Militarily, well, even if Ukraine expels all of the Russian soldiers from its internationally recognized borders, what next? Russia can continue bombing Ukraine for the next 10 years if it really wants to. So, do we call this the end of the conflict, expelling Russian soldiers from Ukraine? Not really. It's just, I know, maybe not prolongs it, but defers it in time.
But I guess the question is, for me, the only thing that gives precision to this conflict is the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO. So once you start thinking in these terms, you will either end up in the world where like Ukraine becomes NATO, or Ukraine doesn't become part of NATO. In both solutions to this conflict, in the sense like Russians are fighting so that Ukraine won't become part of NATO, and Ukraine is fighting and with the Western support, the West actively supports Ukraine so that Ukraine can become part of NATO. So in other words, it gives you these two different directions. And somehow, I think, in a sense, it gives you a much better resolution. Because when people say, well, like Ukraine must win, or like maybe people from Russian side saying that Russia must win, it's like, what does it really mean? I think eventually it comes to the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO.
Yeah, exactly. When you analyze armed conflicts, you have to think of different stages. So you have the tactical stage, you have the operational stage, the strategic, and then you have the political. Yeah. Now, when we discuss, Russians withdrawing from Kherson or I don't know, capturing Crimea, those are tactical or operational developments. But on the political level, when we analyze it, what are the goals of two different sides? So, from the perspective of Kiev, the strategic and political goal is the survival of the state, and preferably within its borders from before 2014. That's the strategic and political goal of Kiev. And what is the best way to ensure it? Like you said, NATO membership. Yeah. Then when we discuss about Russian strategic goals and political goals is to keep NATO out of Ukraine. Yeah. So it's not really about if the Donbass is part of the Russian Federation or not. Yeah. It comes down to a larger political and strategic discussions, because whether Donetsk is part of Ukraine or Russia, it's on a lower operational or tactical level. The politics are more long-term. They're more pronounced, so to say. And as you said, in the end, it comes down to NATO membership. Yes.
Yeah, but also it almost it passes the ball to NATO itself. Like whether NATO wants Ukraine in its to see Ukraine as a member, while Ukraine is having a full-scale war basically with Russia. I mean, in a sense, like whether I would say this question is like it's almost like an elephant in the room, because it all comes to this question whether NATO wants to really fight like with Russia. Because eventually, I guess we all have this understanding that almost from a historical perspective, that like the situation moves towards this direction, right? Towards some, let's say, NATO-Russia clash, whether it will be like a mild type of confrontation or a very serious one. I guess time will show, but something is telling that there is like inertia like moving towards this direction.
Well, I would say that we already have a NATO-Russia confrontation. It's just that NATO isn't the fact that there are no NATO soldiers firing at Russian soldiers. It doesn't mean that NATO isn't a part of this conflict. I would even go as far as to say that Ukraine wouldn't be able to resist Russia without NATO support, being in logistics, supplies, and most importantly, intelligence. Ukraine relies so heavily, and finances, of course. Ukraine relies on NATO in so many ways right now. So saying that NATO is not part of the conflict is just not true.
Yeah, but it's like this idea that whatever West is doing is almost like fulfilling some type of illusionary rights. Like, they're trying to say that they don't do politics. Like, whatever they're doing in Ukraine is not part of politics. It's almost, yeah.
It definitely is. Even, from even discussing, I guess, let's go back from discussing NATO as just one single entity and go back to the interests of the member states. For example, let's take the eastern flank of current NATO, so Baltic states and Poland, etc. It's very much in the interest of these states to have Ukraine in NATO just for their own security. Why? Because if it ever comes to war, you have this huge country in between Poland and Russia that will be hit first in case of a Russia-NATO war. Even going back 100 years, Józef Piłsudski said, Poland cannot be safe without an independent Ukraine. So definitely the interests of certain member states come to play here, especially the United States. The further away we keep Russia from its European sphere of influence, the better. Maybe you have different NATO member states that don't really care that much and wouldn't be so happy to accept Ukraine into the EU or the NATO so quickly. I guess Germany being one of them. I don't think Germany would support Ukraine NATO membership anytime soon.
Officially they do support.
But do you really think that Germany would vote in favor of accepting Ukraine right now into NATO?
I guess Germany is in a very tricky position because it's actually smashed between like Poland on the one hand, the US with its a very pro Western position on the other hand, and Germany has to adapt. Like in a sense, what interests me in this type of situation, that whatever views were prevalent in, let's say, Franco-German circles before the war, they're almost gone. Yes. Or it's like, Macron tried to play this card, he tried to go to media and say that we have to address Russian concerns, and then he got a backlash from all Polish and Baltic states,
and even from Germany. The German foreign ministry said that Putin had his security guarantees, so it's not time to guarantee anything. So he got a universal backlash, I would say. So I guess you have this crisis time and wartime sorting into camps. You had some ambiguity before the war and some gray zone of, political debate whether we should isolate Russia or integrate it into the European system or the global system. I think right now in the West, it's mostly universally, at least publicly acknowledged that Russia is the bad guy and it should be countered. And every enemy of Russia is therefore our friend, hence Ukraine getting all the support. But I don't think that it's in the interest of every single member state of NATO. And I think that even if public declarations of all member states of NATO are that, yes, we want Ukraine in NATO, I don't see Ukraine actually getting accepted into NATO, having a unanimous decision of all NATO members to accept it. Just look at Finland. To accept Finland, how hard it was to get Hungary and Turkey on board. The process is still ongoing, and Finland is a far less controversial member than Ukraine.
But then I guess it's the interesting question of how Turkey blackmails poor Finns and Swedish people.
It's geopolitics, as you said.
Yeah, they're trying to you give us those people. To a point that makes it absurd that they have to hand in people who have citizenship or at least asylum application in let's say Sweden, and they have to hand them in to a guy who is well known dictator himself.
Exactly, and commits very crimes against human rights. So
yeah, but emergency I would say interesting times require extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. That's right. So, but it gives you at least some type of. If you want to talk about the future of this conflict and where the conflict is going, at least it gives you some certainty. Because when you discuss just some abstract, Ukraine must win or Russia must win, you actually lose the whole point of like not just certainty but of any resolution, because whatever you have is like super blurry. It's like you like no one can really, even an official, you ask whatever official you ask, they could not elaborate on what does it really mean for, let's say, Ukraine to win or for Russia to win. And I think it's intentionally, it's like, even I would say from Russian side, it's intentionally vague. But like whenever you kind of like try to understand it through more or less certain perspectives, I think like Ukrainian membership in NATO will be there in discussions. I mean, officially, of course, Russia says something that they must neutralize Ukraine, which basically means like prevent any Ukrainian involvement in NATO alliance.
But you see that the narrative from the beginning of the war, which is almost 1 year ago, which is kind of scary to think of, but the original narrative of demilitarization and denazification, it's gone from the public discourse. When was the last time you heard Solovyov or Putin say denazification?
I think they do use it from time to time. Like, you have to follow in-depth Russian media cycle, but they do use it for I guess internal consumption. They do. I mean, in a sense, because they still have to construct this enemy and they have to dehumanize Ukrainians.
Yes, definitely.
Um, yeah, and it's hard to, I mean, of course, it's hard to explain to Russian people that they have to fight the same type of people. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah, this is the I guess the conundrum that the Russian political system is facing. You have on the one side to justify this war, which involves dehumanizing the opponent, and on the other side you have the narrative that these people are essentially Russians, but they have been misguided by foreign powers and manipulated. And how do you find a balance between these two narratives that are, in theory, mutually exclusive?
yeah, and I think it's very hard, I guess, to see those same type of cities being destroyed and being thrown into front, like being thrown into modern type of warfare, almost like from I don't know, 20 years ago, it would be like a game, but it's a real life, and it's of course it's like really hard to see that same type of cities. I mean, same type of cities, Smolensk or Volgograd. I don't know, and they are part of warfare now. Like they are not like some prosperous cities anymore, but they're like cities like that live through warfare. I mean, this is like, if you, of course, you feel like this perception of people in Donetsk, or like, let's say, in in this like region is the same as like the micro level of life is almost identical to people in Russia. And this is like the hardest thing to realize.
Yes, but the political circumstances still affect the psyche of people living on both sides of the border. And I think, for example, well, I would even go as far as to say that the war actually crystallized the Ukrainian nation and Ukraine as a people, because before, I guess 2014 was the prime example of the fact that Ukraine as a nation wasn't really that established. It didn't know where it was going. It didn't know what its place on the global scale was. Then this allowed Russia to essentially capture Crimea with no fighting, disarm 20,000 Ukrainian troops in Crimea with zero resistance, because Ukraine as a state was still new and still figuring out what it actually is. And I think that the Russian invasion actually gave the state a purpose. It's just to fight Russians, at least for the short term.
But I think like the Crimea was a special case. I think Crimea was Russian, like in a sense, like no one.
Okay,
like,
that's actually like, I will not dispute that the majority of people living there would possibly prefer to be part of Russia. But there were Ukrainian army troops stationed there.
Yeah, but this
loyal
is
to the government in Kiev.
This is
and they surrendered without a fight because the army was so disorganized and the state was in.
But this
chaos.
also actually leads you to a very wonderful example how this micro level connects to like a macro politics, because even like in UN charter itself there is a discrepancy between nations that want self-determination and nations that I mean, the indivisibility of nation. So it's like there is like a actually like a concrete contradiction. And for example, Americans used it in Kosovo. It's like let's create the country as Kosovo, but there is the same thing in UN Charter that says nation
Yes.
is indivisible.
This is the idea of the self-determination of nations is, I would argue, it's faulted, because
Yeah.
if you were to actually follow this idea to the letter, you would have like 5,000 states
Of course, but
on
this
the
is
world,
like
in the world.
this is the whole like in a sense like even Russian claims could be legitimate because if you take examples from the past, I mean if there was something like a international court, not a criminal court but political court that could like consider those cases, like in a sense, like of course Crimea was an example where you definitely you were having like internal turmoil, you were having some form of like civil unrest, and this part of like country said like that's enough. We don't accept this. Like we want to back to people who we know. I mean, they felt Russian, I think, but because they spoke mainly like 96% of population spoke Russian or something like this. I mean, they didn't want to continue living in this country again. But back in the day, even from people living in Crimea, of course, it was very uncertain where like this type of country is going. Maybe it is going to complete civil unrest, or maybe, as some researchers suggested, that Ukraine is a failed state. Like it doesn't, it's not going anywhere. It goes into this like vicious cycle of kind of civil confrontation.
Yeah, the problem with Ukraine was that it was a country divided between, basically along the Dnieper River. Country in the east, you would have the majority of Russian speakers; in the west, more of a Ukrainian speaking nation. But still, at least this is obviously not based on any actual research, but just from anecdotal and my own experience with people who fled from the war to Poland, especially from the eastern parts. Like some people I spoke to, one guy told me, like, I'm from Kharkiv. I don't even know Ukrainian. I speak only Russian. And here they come and they bomb my city and they say it's to protect me. And he said, well, it's just bullshit. Like, I don't buy it. Like, I'm here to make sure my family's safe. I'm just going back to join the Ukrainian army and fight them because they're bastards.
Yeah.
So I don't think that the language lines are as important right now as they were
No,
in
no.
2014.
As we already know from our previous discussion, also the similar culture doesn't imply any type of friendship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It may be very easy to divide.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's true. But it also like it makes me think that it's Ukraine was kind of like put into this type of ambiguous situation where it had to choose between like European Union, which I mean European Union, I guess it's a perfect example of division. Like because you have this pretty racist alliance of states that says to other states that they're not like normal states, and it tries to impose on them that if you want to have a visa-free agreement, you have to have like have to allow gay people to exist and blah blah blah. I mean, all sorts of kind of like ambiguous stuff. But I mean, eventually they do divide people because people from Moscow right now they just simply couldn't go to European Union. It's not like there's something wrong about people living in Moscow, but like the result of this policy is pretty clear, so to speak. Yeah, so I guess this is geopolitics in action.
Definitely, you cannot escape from it.
Yeah,
Sadly.
and I guess that's this is so probably we will just live through this conflict the whole year again.
I really think that it will last for the entirety of the next year.
I guess like the point to discuss is the possibility of escalation that we sort of experienced a couple. I mean, it almost goes in the cycles that there is a point when something goes like. I mean, of course, if you think about from escalation type of perspective, there are many ways to escalate.
Yes, I guess that's exactly what I wanted to ask. What do we define escalation? What venues of escalation do we have?
I guess it really depends. Like if you think about for this year, for of course from I'd say from Russian perspective, the easiest way would be to choose the path of direct NATO-Russian clash. Like whatever you define it, whether it's just simply maybe attacking bases in Poland because they transport weapons to Ukraine and justifying it like this, or maybe of course the hardcore scenario would be just like to entering Baltics, because probably you could just enter Baltics. I mean, people who fight wars, I guess you could never guess like whatever like type of precision, like they should think in very precise terms. And I think like there is something, the possibility of just entering no, not Poland, sorry, entering Baltics, like just because there is nothing, no one that could like.
Yes, that's certainly on the in the military terms. If Russia wanted to capture Baltics, Russia could probably do so like 100 times easier than conquering Ukraine. It's simply because it's a way smaller terrain. But the consequences might be worse for Russia. Why? Because you actually do have NATO troops there. And I don't say that the NATO troops that are present there would stop Russia. They would not. But if Russia wants to capture Baltics, Russia has to kill German soldiers. Russia has to kill Canadian soldiers. Russia has to kill American soldiers. Russia has to kill Polish soldiers. Now imagine any of politicians from this country, imagine them running for re-election without avenging the deaths of soldiers killed by Russia. Americans invaded the Middle East because of one terror group performing one terrorist attack. I do not see a world in which America does not react when American soldiers are killed by the Russian army. I don't see this possibility. And I think
But that's like puts Americans into the shoes of decision makers, because that's what they're saying in terms of, well, if Russia strikes Ukraine with the nukes, I mean, they have like this deterrence logic or deterrence fairy tale in the sense that they would strike back like they would strike them back conventionally.
yes.
Which, if like for me, it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that they will strike Russia, because I mean, from like people in Washington, they should realize that's escalation to the point when you ready to put people living in Los Angeles to the risk of like nuclear annihilation for the Ukraine, like, which is again like from strategy type of perspective. I mean, not Ukraine is not like that big of a deal. Of course, maybe from perspective of like very mega grand things, if you allow Russians using nukes, that would be a big deal. Maybe like from this type of perspective, but it's still hard to believe that they will strike Russia conventionally.
I honestly don't think it's such a hard thing to imagine.
Yeah, but then it leads to this. It's almost like a domino effect.
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
the problem with nuclear deterrence is that nukes are basically like holding hostages. They're only valuable as long as you have them and you don't use them.
Yeah.
Once you use the nuke, you have no bargaining power because people have already died. So I can totally see why NATO might think that it can go unpunished striking Russia conventionally, because Russia has no way to respond in the same capacity. What do I mean? So if NATO strikes Russia just using conventional weapons, and let's say, I don't know, knocks out the strategic arsenal of the land forces of Russia. Okay, this happens. Russia cannot do the same back with conventional weapons. The only choice Russia has left is to use nukes against the West. Yes, but Russia knows that if it uses nukes against the West will use nukes against Russia. So it's this, again, the stability and stability paradox. I think that NATO would feel comfortable striking Russia conventionally in this scenario, knowing that Russia cannot respond in the same proportion as with conventional attacks against the West. They could only use nukes, and Russian decision makers know if we use nukes against the West, we both die.
Yeah, but I think that's the example of like the Western alliance, like using like even conventional weapons to strike Russian facilities. I think it's pretty hardcore one, and I don't know whether it's I think it's not like exactly it's not like that precisely elaborated anywhere in the sense of like in military doctrine.
Yes, that's true. But see, also, so many people attribute to Russia that Russia has the policy of escalation to escalation to de-escalate, but it's not written in any official Russian documents. It's not. Actually it's only written in the French nuclear doctrine. The French have the idea of escalate to de-escalate. Russian official doctrines don't have this written
But
in
didn't
them.
like in Ukraine they definitely escalated
Oh
to
yes, certainly,
de-escalate
certainly yes,
to
but not with
de-escalate.
nukes
Not when you I mean, but they
for now.
escalated to in a sense.
I would also, in terms of Russia and in terms of using nukes, I would be wary of using nukes in Ukraine for one reason, because, well, I would totally believe that the West would give Ukraine nuclear weapons if Russia used nukes in Ukraine. Not officially, but just give them two nukes, and Ukraine will say, "Hey, we have nuclear reactors. We produce these weapons ourselves, and we are responding proportionately to Russian aggression." The West has
Yeah.
clean hands, and Ukraine can respond in the same proportion. I
No,
can
yeah,
totally
yeah.
see that happening.
I mean, in whatever like circumstances Putin uses nuclear weapons, he emphasizes the idea of this like mutual assurance destruction. He never like really uses the idea of nukes as like I will nuke Ukraine.
No,
I never heard him like actually saying those exact words, but when you read CNN, it transforms from mutual assurance destruction to I will nuke Ukraine. That's a little bit like, of course, of Western type of like they trying to portray him as a mad lad.
yeah, and so far we haven't seen any actual indications that Russia would be preparing to use nukes.
which for me is actually way much more scary. It's like if you put yourself into the shoes of such a person who is ready to send rather like thousands of Russian basically to the front instead of using nukes, it gives you actually way much more ominous like person to deal with. It's like it's like if he was just a mad person, he would use nukes. Yeah, it's a one type of guy that with whom you are playing, but you are playing with a way much more strategic person, way much more nuanced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely the portrayals of Putin just being mad are completely wrong. He wouldn't have stayed in power for so long if he was just dumb. Um, that doesn't, of course, mean that Putin does not miscalculate from time to time. Of course, he does. But he definitely thinks rationally, even if he miscalculates, he thinks rationally. So I don't think he would use nukes unless he really, really had to. That is, his power was somehow threatened. If the Ukrainian army was about to capture Moscow, for example, they would totally use nukes. But for now, Russia as a state is not threatened itself. For now, of course, we don't know how the situation will change. So I don't see just doing escalation going down the nuclear path. But I could totally see Russia, for example, deciding to destabilize Baltics, playing on the card that it has, that is, for example, the very major Russian minorities in for example, Latvia and Estonia. Um, Basically, what they did in Ukraine 2014 is use unmarked soldiers without Russian flags actually on the uniforms, staging, proclaiming exactly the green people exactly. Um, I mean, they have a basis and the capacity to do that. For example, in Latvia, and they say they could say it wasn't us. The Russians who lived there, they decided for themselves. 40% of Latvians are of Russian origin. They speak Russian. It's pretty easy to pull off. And I think this combined with a major disinformation campaign and sowing dissent amongst the West, this could pay off. I think if Russia wanted to escalate or at least, put some thorn in American side, this is the way they would go. I don't think they would openly invade the Baltics, but
Yeah,
doing what they do best, which is hybrid warfare, I think they could.
yeah. There is certainly it's a plausible scenario. It just the question is I'm pretty sure to do this they'll have to be like ready, and I don't think it happens when everyone expects it. So there is certainly, even with Crimea, there was a, I would say, the issue. Oh, like, yeah, there was a surprise. I mean,
Yes.
no one really expected it. That's why it played out so well, because no one was expecting it. Then
and and
suddenly
that's
it already
why
happened thing.
the second invasion didn't work out so well because everybody was expecting it. The Americans were warning of it for the last few months, so there was no factor of surprise.
That's true. But
Um,
also,
I remember that actually the media in the EU especially was calling the US alarmists, saying, "Ha, oh my God, you Americans are saying that Russia is going to invade. Oh, they haven't invaded for the past 3 months. You're just scaring us all." And they did invade. So there was no factor of surprise. Judging from the information that we have available, the Ukrainians were aware that an attack is going to start at least like 2 hours before it started. So they must have gotten some information from Western intelligence agencies. And there was no surprise factor. And here, if they wanted to conduct any operation in the Baltics, they would have to have the element of surprise, which means they could not uh, have a conventional military buildup on the borders of the Baltics. It would have to be some
but
undercover
then it's
and special operations.
the question. There is an interesting question whether whatever Russians wanted to do pre-war was a type of like a diplomatic calculation. In other words, whether it was like a threat to use the force, like in the sense of like deterrence, even in American sense. It's like the threat to use the force if you don't really give up to our claims, give up to our. Because I mean, in a sense, they send like the official proposal. There was a diplomatic channel. There was a diplomatic type of conversations that we should, like, put an end to this question of Ukrainian membership in NATO. It was like, it's interesting to say to observe that whatever happened pre-war was all about like Ukrainian membership in NATO, because the Ukrainian claims to membership also escalated, also kind of drastically, in a sense, with the Zelensky and a few years of him in the office, because he, I guess, just of course 2021 pre-war period of time, they really started having those symposiums where they just like brought up some Western experts and they're just like, hey, what about Crimea? You don't recognize Crimea, right? Like, let's get it back, Crimea. Just like, type of like these conversations. I would also think, of course, they would make Russian specialists nervous. And whether like whatever Russians wanted to do was the act of like intimidation, and in a way they thought that it could play out, but it did not. So they had to take actions at certain period of time. I mean, when Putin invaded, I guess he said openly that the conflict is inevitable.
Yes.
In a sense, like, and just the question who strikes first. Like, we are striking first because we are smart. Yeah. So in a way, maybe it is like a.
Okay. So yeah, I guess the initial calculation was exactly to escalate to de-escalate. That is, you would have a relatively short period of tension, but once you have Russian troops reaching the Polish border, like it's fait accompli. Like you cannot do anything to potentially counter that. So I guess of course the West would probably officially condemn this, but there's nothing they could effectively do to prevent that. It didn't work out. Ukraine put up a fiercer resistance than expected. But that was the initial rationale behind it. Basically, to escalate, to de escalate in the longer run.
Or maybe there was a rationale. I mean, in a sense, maybe there was a rationale just to start a war. I mean, well, sometimes I think about like of course people like in the West especially underestimate Putin's and like Putin's logic and Putin's actions, and they think about like, hey, like this dude miscalculated, but what if like this dude just simply, like, his idea was to start a war, his idea wasn't to end the war, because if you think from perspective of a long-term thinker, like a strategist. You just simply start this thing, and then like you, because like the war itself changes dispositions, it changes everything in the system. It's like the world before the war is different type of the world than the world after.
But is it a world more favorable to Russia? I don't think so.
I mean, it definitely puts it into a certain course, so into a certain trajectory, because I would say like whatever trajectory was in the system for Russia before the war, it wasn't that favorable. Because I mean, Russia was in this like very in the type of situation that it was kind of trying to sit on both chairs. It wasn't really Western because it was already heavily sanctioned by Western powers, but it was still in the sense of like trying to be Western. It was still a democracy, like officially. It was kind of like in this like weird place of like really like long term thinking was like impaired, like in the sense of like there was no long term thinking. But now it's more.
I definitely get what you mean. This is like basically Russia hasn't, before the war, Russia hasn't decided what it wants to be, whether it wants to have a full blown out confrontation with the West or accept and basically concede to the West and go with the flow of the what the West would dictate. It was sitting on the fence. And yeah, that's certainly true that Putin definitely, with his decision to invade Ukraine, changed this, and he set Russia on a very certain anti-West and confrontational path. But I really don't think that anybody starts a war expecting it to last years. Like, there's not a single war in human history where the people who were deciding to start the war were like, yeah, guys, this will last for the next 20 years and millions will die. Everybody said, oh yeah, this will be a fast war. This will be over. We'll be back home by Christmas. And I really think that was the thinking that Putin had, that this is what will happen. But I cannot disagree with you saying that he decided on a course, for a long-term course for Russian history, and there's no turning back from this decision.
I would rather say that of course no one knows what Putin wants when Putin thinks, but I would rather say I'll give up to this idea that he was like really strategic. I mean, of course, he had like a plan that if he captures Kiev and Zelensky would flee, then of course suddenly like the whole affair would be victorious and very short one.
And judging from the movements of the Russian troops, that's exactly what they hoped for.
And also judging from the things that happened after, I would say that he was also prepared for a long-term conflict. Like in a sense, like because you put like countries
I totally disagree.
Like I would say because you put country under so much stress, and you as a as a decision maker, you are sure that the country would sustain itself. Like you think, okay, he knew that they would impose sanctions. He also knew that probably the conflict would last for a while. He probably knew that that he would be still in power, like in a sense, like all those things that how the conflict plays out after almost a year now. I mean, in a way, he should have predicted it. Otherwise, like, I mean, if he was some kind of like a roaster type of a dictator that probably he thought he had the power to do it, but suddenly no. The population said like this is like a red flag for us. But like the population was kind of like almost like in a state of shock for a while, but after a while it's almost like, sure, let's do this, like, you know what I mean?
People adjusted, yeah.
No, because I also think it's important because, like, for example, he couldn't mobilize Russian population at the start of the war.
No, definitely not.
But like after a while, he could.
But from a purely military perspective, if you prepare for a long-term war, you mobilize before. This is the problem that Russian army is facing right now. Russia has a very effective design system to mobilize masses of soldiers. But why is it not? Why wasn't it working when they first announced mobilization? Because the idea is that you have a cadre of trained officers and soldiers who, once you start mobilization, these soldiers then train demobilized soldiers. You have professional, experienced soldiers who train people who were pulled from their civilian lives. And right now, at least initially what happened, I guess Russia is correcting for this right now, was that you had mobilized thousands of people, and who's to train them? There was nobody to train them because everybody was on the front.
But this is exactly like the brilliancy of the move. Like if you think about it,
I disagree. It was brilliant.
No, but like
I think it was a miscalculation.
In a way, imagine like you, like even in January 2022, you have a degree and you mobilize your own population for the war with Ukraine. I mean, like even from back then, it sounds like the status quo was that Putin is a dictator. He's a very powerful person and he could do whatever he wants internally, but there was still like a red flags in Russian society. And those red flags are that like, you wouldn't like mobilize without no good reason. I mean, even in September when he announced mobilization, there was still, of course, a little small backlash, but like very subtle one. But of course, like once there was a war for a couple of months, and like Russian people saw, those motherfuckers, they fight with us. We have to show him who is the boss.
No, definitely.
And it's
I agree that radicalization was there, and I think that I agree with you that Putin right now is pretty skillfully exploiting and managing the overall psyche of the population. But I really don't think that his original thinking was, okay, I'm going to start a war, I will let it drag out for 6 months, and then I'll be able to mobilize.
No, but I think like his initial like plan was just to start a war, and then let's see. I mean, it's always...
He already did kind of in 2014. It was just frozen.
True, but like there was still no war. I mean, of course, like officially, everything was still more or less in a very no war conditions.
Well, there's still no war. There's a special military operation.
Yeah, there was a war in Donbass, though. But I mean, there was no escalation. But like, I mean I guess it's important. Just like if you really want to understand like international politics, you have to really ask like, what did he really want? And of course, I do think. I mean, just like my gut feeling would be that he wanted something bigger than. I mean, he wanted just a protracted conflict, probably. Because, I mean, it could play out differently, but at least it solidifies his power. This is like, it definitely does.
So you really don't think he was hoping to capture Kiev?
I mean, but it was like a high win, high reward. Also, like a lot of like high stakes, high reward type of operation. But I don't think he put all his, money on it. Like, he just like, it was okay if this can happen, it's good, but if it doesn't happen, we continue. I mean, like in a sense, like also it's important to think about that, like the costs, like in terms of like human costs, they don't really matter for him. Like quite literally, like either from Ukrainian perspective or from Russian perspective. I mean, it doesn't really matter how many people would it cost to capture Kyiv. I mean, it's not a question that like this type of person would ask. It's like whether he can do it or not. Like, but in a sense, like there was like a moment. Of course, he was probably really, he hoped it could happen, but it didn't happen. But I think he did have a plan B.
For me, it's just hard to imagine. Well, definitely, you always need to have a plan B. But and I think that they really did have a plan B. But was it protracted war for many years? I'm not sure. Especially just judging, for example, from the American announcements from the beginning of the war. Remember that on the first night of the war, the Americans said that, judging from their analysis, Kiev will fall in 3 days. That's what the Americans said. They offered to evacuate the entire Ukrainian government. But then even if the Americans thought that the Ukraine will fall so fast, I think that the Russians thought so as well.
But then I guess it shows American type of analysis, because again, he didn't have like 2 million, right? Like in other words, he had like 200,000, and he had intentionally he had an attack from all the directions.
He did attack.
He didn't like put all this 200 in the attack of the Kiev. He did attack from all the directions. And I mean,
yes, that's true.
And the person who knows, of course, military history should understand, like, it's not possible. And like, again, like, he probably, there was some, again, like, I guess I would say like just one thing. It's like when time passes and you look at people who say all this stuff about Putin and his thinking, suddenly at a certain point in time, a long period of arc, like, like 2, 3, 4 years, like 5 years, like, past, like, you just see that, like, they were wrong. I mean, like, people who expected Putin to collapse in 2014, they were wrong.
They were absolutely wrong. People, I don't think Putin will collapse until his death.
Yeah, but this is like, the brilliancy, because like there is something that like he understands that probably no one does. Like, in a sense, it's like when you really observe this type of events, after a certain period of time, you just like, he knows something. Like, he is onto something, and like he, in a sense, like he understands something that no one else does.
What is that?
Who knows? But Putin does understand this. Like, like what I mean, it's if you observe like again, like comparing it like almost to like ethnology, and like, if you observe like a very beautiful, very intelligent, like a chimp, like he definitely knows something.
I really think that Putin's rationale was in some ways parallel to the rationale of Japan in 1940s when they attacked the Americans. They basically thought that, okay, the Americans are encroaching upon us. We don't have that huge of a chance to actually win. But we're going to do it anyway because it's our only chance. And I honestly think that was his rationale, was I have to do it if I'm to preserve my idea of, this Russia as a powerful state, as a key player in the international arena, and not somebody who just, bandwagons with the West. This is what I have to do. And he hoped that it would turn out perfectly and capture Kiev in a few days, but it didn't. So he's working with what he has left. So a protracted conflict. But I really don't think that he hoped, that he really thought that it will last that long. Because he was ready, it might happen, but it was, a plan B, not plan A.
For some reason that it was the whole initial plan, like to have a protracted conflict. And probably
it's just for me hard to imagine.
But again, like think about not like internal, external. Like don't think about external events. Think about internal ones. You make sure that whatever you do, the country will survive and sustain itself. You have to have resources. Also, like from sanction perspective, you need to calculate that your country will survive whatever sanctions you have. And I mean, there were some discussions, and there were some like insights that people in like Russian central bank, 2 years before the war, they calculated very extreme economic scenarios, like almost like to a point when Russia would be cut completely from economy, like from world economy, completely. Even now, it's not the same the same way they calculated, but that it would be cut completely from the world economy. So they still kind of had those plans, contingency plans for something big, like, and that something big happened. I guess it puts. I would say probably when Putin started the war, he was pretty sure that he wouldn't end it. Like whoever ends the war would be Putin, probably someone else.
I honestly think he was thinking that he will finish this war one way or another. I really don't think that he was ready for a possibility that his advance is entirely stopped. Maybe he was thinking, okay, maybe we will not capture Kiev in 1 week, but in 3 months.
Yeah.
And you could see that they were trying for the first 3 months to really get into Kiev, but they finally decided, okay, no, this is not going to happen, and they withdrew.
But then again, the question, like, was he an idiot? Because
I don't think he was an idiot. Definitely not.
in a sense, if you think that with 200,000 troops you could capture that big of I mean, you could first initiate this big of a conflict through this big of um, confrontational line, so to speak, and you could, in the say, like in the meantime, you can like succeed in this conflict. Then that's, I mean, in a sense that like if he really thought this way, he was probably an idiot.
I definitely think that the incompetency was on the level of Russian military, not political decision making.
But no,
because the strategy that the Russian military adopted basically looks like it tried to resemble the American operations in Iraq, but it just omitted a few key factors, like the fact that before the American invasion of Iraq, America bombed the country to rubble for 1 month, basically. And that's why they were able to do this basically right to capture the capital in a few days with very minor resistance. Russia did not do that, even though the movements of their land troops seem to indicate that they want to duplicate the success of the Americans in Iraq. So yeah, I think that Putin wasn't an idiot. Definitely, I think he just trusted his military commanders too much.
Yeah, but they all there is something way much more ominous that it's hard to comprehend. Maybe, like, I mean, I know it sounds. This is like the whole, like, you kind of move into direction of conspiracy theories almost, but it's still important if you ask yourself, like, this person probably has like very good information and he's smart. Like, whatever smart you define in international relations. I mean, it's like whatever I say, it's like you people observe international relations. He does international relations. It's just shut the fuck up. Like, like he's like the fucking player. I mean, again, it's like, for me, it's like when you see Magnus Carlsen playing, of course, like, he makes a blunders and like computer shows this is a blunder. And he's just like, oh, he made a blunder, like, go. Yeah, it's like, he's a stupid guy. It's like, no, like, you don't see the end of his game. Like, just like, first of all, wait a little bit. And because, I mean, again, like.
So do you think that he has some end game envisioned and he's actually on the right track to achieve it?
I mean, I probably think his end game is just to start the war, but not to finish. And this, I guess, gives you an idea, because I mean, he's not an idiot. He wants to preserve whatever he created during this 20 period of time, and he can do it only by continuing this war with the Western Ukraine, or to be more precise, by continuing the war with the Ukraine and the West, and thus the West. He could envision the future of Russia that is non-Western. It's moving into some, like, separate direction. And whoever comes into power, or whoever is like his successor, is like, he will have to deal with this conflict.
Okay, so as I understand your argument, what you mean is that Putin said, basically created a certain idea of Russia and put Russia on a certain direction, a certain track.
Yeah.
And anybody who comes after him will have to continue his legacy.
Yeah.
And his politics, because there's no turning back.
Yeah. There's no turning back.
With that I can certainly agree. He definitely preserved, put Russia on a certain track, and he will be a major name in history books for sure.
Yeah, like 1,000 years from now. I mean, he's like a Caesar. Like the guy, like the people would read, like, I mean, would they read history books? Probably not. Probably some information in their brain already, but they would know Putin. And no one else, basically. They wouldn't know Biden. It's like, who is Biden?
But they may remember Reagan.
Reagan? Probably, yeah. But Putin, they would remember.
Yeah.
Like, this is the guy who changed it. I mean, I guess that's the difference between, like, he's a real actor. Like, some people just read history. He makes history. And this is, like, a very big difference.
True.
Like, this difference that really is a bigger. I mean, again, and this is just you need to pay a certain tribute to those people, like, in a way, not being like disrespectful to type of deeds they do.
True. Yeah, that's something.
Yeah, so I guess we will leave through next year.
Yes.
And come back next year and
We'll see how our predictions hold up.
We just had only one prediction so far. That the
Well,
war will continue.
Hopefully, we will not have to record such an episode next year sitting in a bunker, hearing bombs fall. Hopefully, we will not have to say, "We told you so."
We told you so. So we both agree that the conflict would continue.
Absolutely.
But yeah, and there is a chance of escalation. But I don't think we both believe that the escalation is that real. Probably like going to be protracted conflict.
I honestly think, like, just from my perspective watching this, I think there's no way that you will have an open Russia-NATO war. But then again, looking back at history, all of the major wars from the past few hundred years, before they broke out, everybody said there's no way there's going to be a war. True. That's a new factor in the equation. So that's maybe something that will hold us back. But we'll see. Nuclear weapons are still fairly new in human history. We don't have too much material to
70
work
years.
with.
That's true. And yeah.
So hopefully it's a major stabilizing factor.
But it's also still back to normal for Europe. We've lived through the conflict for almost like all the history of Europe is the history of war.
It is, yes.
So
back to normal.
Back to normal.
Sadly.
Sadly. Thank you very much.
As always.
See each other, I guess, in the next episode.
Exactly. Next year.